Hello, today we're going to talk about CBDCs. There's a lot of press recently about widespread adoption, or at least interest in many countries in exploring a central bank digital currency. And on some sides, people are sort of excited, this is an innovation. And on the other side, there's confusion and fear that it's like humanity's worst nightmare. So today I'm going to break down for you the good, the bad, and the ugly with central bank digital currencies. Hello, I'm Molly Elmore with Clever Hummingbird, and today we're going to talk about CBDCs. Stands for central bank digital currency, but it is a little bit catchy to say CBDC. So from now on, I'm just going to refer to it as that. A couple of years ago, this idea was like a conspiracy theory that no way will we all move to this sort of digital money. But then when you kind of talked about that, you're like, well, we kind of have digital money now. Like I might not use cash very often. So how would a CBDC be any different than our current system? And why are people scared of them? I'm not really scared of using my debit card or my credit card. Why is this so different and scary? And on the same side, if it's not that different than what we have now, why is it considered some sort of like magical innovation? Because I don't feel like our current system is terribly magical. So we're going to cut down to the brass tacks, if that makes sense, and dig into the good, the bad, and the ugly with CBDCs. All right, so what exactly is a CBDC? It is a central bank digital currency. It is a form of money issued directly by a central bank to citizens. And my understanding of the difference between currency and money is that you could use anything for money. I mean, you and I could, one of us could do a service for the other one. You could, mow my lawn and I could pay you in acorns. And if you think that acorns are acceptable form of value exchange, then I could pay you in acorns, and then you could go down and buy some, eggs from your other friend in acorns. So like anybody can use anything as money as long as enough people agree that that is acceptable. But currency is different in that this nation's generally issued currency, or they determine what is acceptable currency for their citizens. And it's just a way, I think, to standardize and keep people from not, if you have everybody using a different form of money, it makes it difficult to collect payment for taxes. It makes it difficult to kind of have an economy. So a CBDC is a form of money, but not all money is currency. All right. So generally, when we talk about a CBDC, it's assumed that it will likely be a blockchain-based currency, but it doesn't have to be. I don't think this is sort of a new concept. There aren't really any rules. But for all intents and purposes, whenever I see any discussion about CBDCs now, it is referring to using a blockchain for delivery of it. Because one massive advantage to blockchain technology and digital assets is that I can send you money very quickly. If you watched any of my videos about correspondent banking or other, I get to figure out which other ones I did. I know I've talked about in a few. But right now, like you can't send money through the internet. Like I can send you information, I can send you an invoice, you could pay that invoice, which basically is just telling me that you're agreeing to this transaction. But the actual exchange of money is like done through this very old school system where each bank has like a bunch of bank accounts around the world. And it's just like being credited and debited from these various bank accounts. So if you look at the internet as revolutionary in that it was it enabled like instantaneous exchange of information, which is truly remarkable. So many businesses were transformed from the internet. The blockchain version of the internet is this sort of internet of value, will allow instantaneous value to be sent and not just simply information. And value is like a buzzword for money. So I can now send you money instantaneously. Now, the interesting thing about the blockchain is I'm never actually really sending you money. I'm just essentially sending you access to money that lives kind of in this database in the cloud, the blockchain. And that's pretty cool and revolutionary, because all these issues with, like, if let's say I say I'm going to pay you for something, we have this agreement, but then something happens, I don't have the money, or the transaction failed for whatever reason. It could sometimes take days to figure that out. So to be able to like settle these transactions very, very quickly has a lot of cool advantages for businesses and other types of people who take payments. So that is sort of the innovation side, is that it drastically speeds up transactions, the settlement of these transactions, and it gets rid of a certain kind of risk, where if you and I are in a transaction and it takes a couple of days for that to settle, one of us is taking risk in the meantime that the other one is good for it. And instantaneous settlement kind of makes that go away. There are some dystopian concerns, though, and they are really related to sort of one aspect of it. And right now, like, currencies don't necessarily work the same way in every country. As an American, I'm more familiar with the American system, but other countries sort of model this in a similar way. But right now, and the one difference between the US and other countries is that in the US commercial banks have a tremendous amount of power. They are the owners of the central bank, what's called the Fed. And they have incredible amount of influence over government, policy, etc. That's not the case in every country. So just because this system that we're going to go through today makes sense in the US, it's not going to necessarily fit. Like in China, for example, my understanding is that the commercial banking sector in China does not have nearly as much influence as it does in the US, and that the CCP sort of is calling the shots. And even in Europe, the commercial banks aren't this sort of force to be reckoned with in the same way that they are in the US. So in the US, we have this system right now that is basically two tiers. And if you've ever owned a store or an e-commerce store, like, it kind of works in a similar manner. And that you have this kind of like wholesale layer, which is how businesses interact with other businesses. So right now, you'll see this sort of like Jay Powell meme where it's like money printer go burr, and it's like Jay Powell like printing this money thing. The Fed doesn't actually print money that we use. The Fed has the ability to print reserves, which is kind of like this wholesale money that's only used by other banks who have an account with the Fed. So if you think about it like a train track, all the Fed banks have like a station on the train track, and this money reserves kind of moves around through that system, but it's like a walled garden. These train tracks don't go anywhere outside of this wholesale system. And it's truly a wholesale bank-to-bank currency system. And when the Fed issues reserves to a commercial bank, let's say JP Morgan is an example, then JP Morgan can take those reserves and issue currency to people, to government, to businesses, etc., through that system. So like if somebody gave me a bunch of Fed reserves, that'd be pretty awesome. But what would I do with it? I don't have an account with the Fed. I'm not a bank. I would have no way to spend it. Like I can't go down to the grocery store and pay for stuff in Federal Reserve reserves. So we have this sort of two-tier system where the Fed issues currency, but it's only used by banks. And then the banks have the ability to multiply that currency and issue more to people. The vast majority of currency that enters into the economy from the US, in the US dollar world, comes from commercial banks issuing loans. If you go and get a mortgage, that money didn't exist until that mortgage was paid to the person who received the money, the former homeowner. If you go and buy a car, all that money did not exist. It goes to the car dealership and then enters the economy. Even if you go and get a credit card and you have a $20,000 limit on it, and let's say you went and spent bought $20,000 worth of stuff that first day, that's new money that's now created and introduced into the system. And there's sort of this process by when you pay that back, that money kind of goes away. So the idea that the Fed has been issuing all this new money that's not really how it worked, because a lot of commercial banks were very participatory in the increase, by issuing tons and tons of loans that went out into circulation. So when we talk about CBDCs, there's two types. There is a wholesale CBDC, which would be a blockchain version of what the Fed issues now to other banks. And then there is a retail CBDC, which is quite different than what we have now, which is when the central bank would issue a currency directly to the people, and it would go around the commercial banks. That is quite different than the system we have now for a very, quite a few reasons. Now, we're going to talk mostly about, actually, we're going to talk about FedNow for a second. This was announced a couple months ago, and it was sort of created this panic that the US now has a CBDC and that this is going to sort of infringe upon consumer rights and that type of thing. FedNow is a wholesale thing. This is, again, how banks send money to other banks, similar to the reserve system, but it also involves actual currency that is sent from a bank to a bank. So if I go to my bank, let's say I have Wells Fargo, and I need to send $1,000 to my credit card company, my credit card banks with Chase, then the money kind of goes from me to my bank. Well, the money was probably already there sitting in my bank account. And then my bank will send that money to the credit card company's bank. So it's a bank-to-bank payment, typically done through like ACH. And that is, again, this sort of walled garden where all these banks within the US are sending money to other banks so that people can pay bills. Primarily, you can get paid from payroll through your company. You could pay your taxes. I mean, if you've ever used bill pay with your bank and you can kind of send money to a variety of things, it could be to another person, but it could be it's often to businesses or tuition or a medical facility. That's sort of what FedNow is doing, is it's making the process of sending money bank to bank much faster. Now, what's interesting to me about that, because my husband used to be a computer programmer who worked for the company that created that bill pay system. And I did talk about this before, so forgive me if you've already heard it. But what the banks would do, what the company that he worked for would do, they're called CheckFree, but now they're part of this company called Fiserv, is Fiserv would pull the money out of your bank account the day you agreed to pay a bill through bill pay. And it would hold it for like 3 or 4 days. And it would go and lend that money out for short-term interest. And that was how they made money. They don't charge you a fee to use bill pay. They would make money off the float. And that would avoid anybody having to pay like a fee, sort of like a subscription fee or membership fee for this type of thing. Now, I think the banks had to pay something, but like we as a person using bill pay, they made money off of our money through the float. Now, when this FedNow system comes into play and the money gets transferred instantly, there goes the float money. So I'm curious how this it's going to change bill pay a lot, because that whole business model will now be disrupted. So this idea of FedNow does not concern me at all, because it's quite different than the stuff we're going to talk about in a second. It's going to make bank-to-bank payments more efficient. When you actually pay a bill, it will get there immediately. So if you're somebody who if you're a recipient of bill pay, that's awesome, because you don't have to wait days now. And it's really just updating the wholesale system that's in place currently that is just kind of antiquated. There's nothing dystopian in my view of FedNow and anything related to wholesale CBDCs. Retail CBDCs are a completely different animal, and that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this. Before I get into the things that concern me about them, we're going to talk about some benefits. So if the central bank were to issue money directly to consumers, you would be able to, and let's say there was a situation where like we had like in 2020 where stimulus checks were sent out, that required quite a bit of time for that to be implemented, because it had to kind of like figure out who are all the citizens, and then where is their bank, and send money to their bank account. And like I have a couple banks, and mine went to the one where I paid taxes out of. So I think they were using that database to figure out the list of all the people. And let's say you were somebody who like didn't make any money, so you just never paid taxes. I don't know how you got your check. Like, I'm not sure how that worked, I'm sure they had to have multiple systems in place to sort of handle that. And then the other interesting thing that doesn't really come up much in discussing around CBDC is if you take commercial banks out of the equation and the money goes directly to people, how do you take out a loan? How does that work? If the commercial bank, I mean, I guess maybe they could still be given reserves and they could still issue loans, but are you going to get that loan in a CBDC? So are you going to give the commercial banks the ability to mint tokens? That's not clear to me how the two-tiered system could work with a central bank digital currency where the minting of the tokens is done by one entity. I mean, it's possible, I guess, that they could just go to the Fed and say, hey, Fed, I got a new person who wants a credit card. They want $10,000 in credit. Give me 10,000 tokens, of this CBDC. But the thing about the credit card is that the money doesn't exist with a credit card until you go out and make a charge. So are they going to mint all these tokens in advance? So that's why the retail CBDC falls apart a little bit in our commercial banking world, because if you think about the steps by which money is distributed now, it would be a big, big change. I actually, and I've said this before, and this kind of comes from other analysts as well, I don't think we're going to see a retail CBDC in the United States simply because the commercial banks would get cut out, and they're very powerful and they have a lot of influence over Washington. For them to sign their own death warrant on the end of commercial banking, they'd no longer be able to issue loans in the same way. As I just explained, it's more complicated when you have blockchain money. Who does the minting of the tokens? How does that work? I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think we will very much see this type of thing in other countries, specifically the UK, Europe, via the euro, and other countries like Canada. So I'm going to talk about some of the dystopian concerns. And if you are in one of those other countries, it's definitely something to be aware of. But in the US, I think that we might get a pass for a while at least because of the influence of the commercial banking sector. But there is an advantage in that if the government wanted to send you money, they could do it very quickly and inexpensively. That is the end of the advantages, in my opinion. I'm not a fan of retail CBDCs. I think that the potential for a power grab is really high. And unless we had a CBDC Bill of Rights to ensure that sort of the dystopian things I'm going to share with you in a second don't happen, then they always could happen. And once you have this new system in place, everybody's using it. If all of a sudden now it morphs into something that's not in our interest, you're kind of stuck. How are you going to undo that and fix it? Because the key difference between the money we have now and a digital blockchain CBDC is that it would very likely be built on a blockchain that incorporates smart contracts. And this is different than Bitcoin or even XRP. I can spend all the XRP that I want. There's no smart contract on that currency that has sort of rules programmed in. And if you're not familiar with what a smart contract is, it's essentially a little computer program that executes on a blockchain with rules. So for example, NFTs are a good example of something that has a smart contract. So let's say that I mint an NFT for all the members of my club, and I have a special Discord group for people who are members. You can program that NFT to allow me access to tier 1 of the Discord. And when I go to Discord checks to see, do you have the right NFT to give me access? Now, there's also a bunch of other things that smart contracts can be programmed to as CBDCs, but generally it's the idea that a series of if-then statements could be programmed into the currency to create rules. Not unlike, if you got public assistance like WIC in the US, where sort of food stamps they used to call it, you're not allowed to spend food stamps on anything you want. There's rules programmed into it. Now, right now, my understanding is that the store has to sort of help enforce those rules, and that you could have an employee at a store who helps you figure out a way around it, maybe. But with this sort of more smart contract thing, it would be done kind of like in an automated, computerized manner. And the big question I have with the CBDC is who exactly controls this smart contract? We're going to go through a bunch of these dystopian scenarios. Who is the actual person at the central bank who makes these rules? Are they voted on? Are they public in advance? Do citizens have a say in them? Do like the politicians that are elected oversee it, or is it some sort of like permanent state figure who is always in power, who isn't elected? So like somebody in the military or the banking side. Like I don't even know, because there's very little discussion about who would control the smart contract on a CBDC. If you ask generally, people will say, well, it'll be the central bank, and be like, well, thousands of people work at the central bank. Is it going to be the guy who's in charge of it? Is it going to be a particular committee? Like it's very unclear who that is, because that's a big deal. The person and the group that decides how your money is programmed has incredible amount of authority in your life. So this is something that is important. So we're going to go over a couple of scenarios about what could be programmed. So there's a lot of connections between the group who loves CBDCs, the retail CBDCs, and some popular like political agendas like climate change. And you could have your currency programmed to only allow a certain amount of meat to be purchased in a certain time frame. For some, actually, I know exactly why, but the reason there is a war from this group on quality proteins that are beneficial to human health, and sort of being labeled as dangerous for the environment. But the math does fall apart and the science falls apart if you dig into it very deeply, but they hope people don't do that. However, it could be programmed into a CBDC that only certain categories of purchases are allowed within a specific time frame. One of them could be meat. And this is where the whole like we'll eat bugs and be happy about it thing comes from as well. You might be told that you can't have any more meat this month, and you now have to select something from the alternative products, whether it be the plant-based section or the bug-based section. The carbon movement also falls apart into a lot of scrutiny. This is sort of this idea that each person is only allowed to have a certain amount of carbon credits that they are to consume in a particular month. This is also referred to as a carbon credit allowance and will be possibly tied to the technology that MasterCard developed, where you can track your carbon footprint via purchases that you make. And if you exceed a certain amount of purchases over a certain time period that use a lot of carbon, like for example, you might only be allowed to buy a certain amount of gas in a month, or you might only be able to buy a certain number of plane tickets, or some other type of purchase that correlates with high energy usage, which again, it falls apart. Like there's lots of kinds of energy. And if we're talking about carbon dioxide emissions, like people emit carbon dioxide. So it's not a foolproof system, but MasterCard did develop a personal credit card a couple of years ago that does track carbon usage and can be programmed to turn off if you exceed your particular amount. And so what would happen is you'd likely be forced to live in a city where if you exceeded your carbon allowance, then you would have to buy more carbon credits, which would probably be unaffordable to the majority of people. So you'd be forced to use some sort of public transportation, which would make it virtually impossible to live in a rural area unless you were very wealthy. So there's sort of another part of that agenda. All right, so this also ties into the idea of a social media credit score. And actually, I had a slide in here that I think got moved around, which we'll just hop here for a little bit. So in order for all of this stuff to work, we need what's called a digital ID, because your carbon credit database tracking all the carbon credits you use. And we're going to talk for a second in about social credit scores and other databases, like let's say your health history. All of these things must be tied together via a common denominator. We are just going to go through these first. Okay. So let's say you are outspoken and vocal about something on social media, and it's not something that the government really wants you to talk about. It's maybe something that if dug in too deeply, might raise a lot of questions about what's really behind this particular initiative or rule or whatever. And so the best way to prevent a lot of people from learning that maybe what I heard on the news wasn't correct was for them to share that information on social media. So as we've seen the last couple of years, a lot of social media content can be suppressed. And the way you can stop that is to penalize somebody for posting something that is not in line with what you're supposed to say. If you've heard any of my videos, I got kicked off Facebook for a month for posting a meme, which was not really that big of a deal meme. And you had to understand the context of why I posted it for the meme to even make sense. And I was kicked off for a month, which was a real pain. So it was basically a social credit score type thing where I post something that was not in alignment with what I was supposed to be posting, and I was punished. Now, the punishment in this case wasn't really that severe because whatever, I just did other stuff for a month. But let's say the punishment for that offense was now $1,000 fine. Can you imagine posting a meme that Facebook doesn't like and you get fined $1,000? And there's no due process. You don't have a hearing where you get to make your case. The money's just taken out, and it's done automatically via the smart contract. There's no one to call. There's no one to complain to. We don't even know who makes these rules, right? So we don't even know who you would get mad to. If you've ever tried to dispute something with Facebook, you know that that's not an easy thing to do. You can't just call 1-800-Facebook and talk to a rep and plead your case. It just doesn't work that way. So this is sort of the other thing, is that all of these other databases could connect back to a retail CBDC and be used to enforce compliance with things. Whereas right now the consequences aren't that big of a deal. But if you started fining people, that would be a very big deal. They're also, kind of like how food stamps now limit what types of things you're allowed to buy. There could be a very rigorous list of rules around the types of purchases that each person's allowed to buy, be it with a CBDC, meaning maybe you're not allowed to buy organic food. You have to only buy something from the sustainable food section. And I'm sure they'll do a very good job with marketing labels and make these less nutritious options sound great. But in the reality is who is this person that gets to decide what I can buy? I didn't sign up for that. If I go and have a job or do whatever to earn money, why is any entity telling me how on earth I can spend that money? So I see that. I really hope people do not accept this type of system. But sadly, if humans are in a situation where you have to choose between starving and these rules, I don't think that's a difficult choice. People will not starve. There also is something called negative interest rate that can be programmed in. So if you, I'll put the link to this video, but I did a video a while ago on the velocity of money. And this is essentially an economic concept where the more quickly money flows through an economy, the healthier it is considered. So if you had a country that was in recession and people were scared to spend money, one way to get out of that recession would be to encourage people to start spending. Because the idea is that the more people are spending, the less fearful they are, and it helps kind of stimulate and gets that flow of money going. Now, unfortunately, if people spend all the money that they have and they're not saving anything, that is called having a low time preference, which is dangerous because it means you're not really optimistic about the future. There's a balance here between spending money because you're confident that good times, that you're going to get paid again and that you don't have to be hoarding your money, balanced with also having some savings so that you're invested in your future. Because if you think the world's going to blow up tomorrow, what's the point of saving anything because we'll all be dead or whatever? So there's this sort of dance with velocity of money. So what now, if let's say I was a very totalitarian bad leader and I wanted to control all of you and I wanted you to have no ability to fight back at me, what I would do is I would make it so that you can't save money. Because saving money gives people options. You can quit a job you don't like because you're like, screw you, I have a bunch of money saved up. I'm not going to put up with this. If you live in a place that sucks and you have a lot of money saved up, you could move somewhere else and be like, I'm not going to live in this crappy place. So having savings gives people tons of options that is very liberating. But if you've ever been in a situation, I certainly have, where like I was flat broke and I was in a job I didn't like, living in a place I didn't like, you're kind of stuck. You don't have many options when you don't have savings. So what can be done with a CBDC to ensure that people don't have a lot of options and become completely dependent on the state is to program the money so that it expires. Kind of like a gift card. Have you ever gotten one of those store gift cards, and it's supposed to be real money that you can, buy a dinner at Red Lobster, but it's only good between now and 30 days from now. That can be done with actual central bank digital currency where money will expire, or at least worst case, it expires and it's all gone. Less worst case is that it kind of, how interest rate, like you earn money on it. Imagine the opposite of that, where you sort of are deducted money each month. So it's sort of like your savings diminishes. And the longer you hold that money, the more money gets deducted out of it. So it's a disincentive to savings because your account becomes worth less over time until one day it's worthless. So that is part of the idea. They have a nice catchy label for that called negative interest rates, which makes no sense grammatically, but essentially is a fee on savings. We have been programmed to accept this a little bit. If I put my money into a checking account and I don't maintain a certain balance, I can be charged a fee. Now that the bank has the choice to do that, but that is in essence a form of a negative interest rate, and that you're now taxing me on my money because I haven't met some condition that you want, which is to have more money in there. Okay. This could also be tied to health databases. We'll just call them health databases. Do not get in trouble with the video people. And if you don't comply with some sort of health mandate, you could be fined, or your money might not work somewhere. So if you don't have a particular status for your health mandate, then you go to buy stuff at the grocery store, your money could just not work. That's a pretty powerful way to enforce compliance with something people don't want to do, is to say you either do this or you can't buy stuff, because the majority of us need to buy food. And that's sort of the bare minimum we need to buy. Many people have to, pay for shelter, have to pay for energy, for heat, especially if you live somewhere cold. There's things that we need to buy to survive. And if your ability to buy those things was turned off, that would be really sucky. Kind of related to that, if you have not kept up with a schedule of health mandates, you could be forced to do that because your purchases could be denied unless you did it. So the key of this is that in order for this type of a system to work, there's some pretty advanced technology in that you have to connect all of these databases in real time and have them be pretty flawless. And it seems like China's gotten this down, and they do have this sort of app-based system where you have this sort of status. It's green or red, and if your green status is good, then you can buy stuff. If your status is red, then you can't. And they have connected it to social media. They have connected it to this health thing. So it can be done, which is not good for them. The other concern about a CBDC is, let's say you got paid by your job in CBDC. That's one way that a lot of people may be forced to adopt this new thing, is that they get paid in that way. And you might be like, all right, well, no big deal. You want to pay me in whatever. I don't care. I'm going to go to some sort of exchange and swap that CBDC for something that I want. Let's say I'm a Bitcoiner, I want XRP or whatever. Any sort of asset that is something I choose. Well, the smart contract can be programmed to only approve certain types of transactions. And you might have a score that says, you know what, you're kind of a troublemaker. You're not allowed to swap your CBDC for a Bitcoin. Only people with a certain status are allowed to do that. You can only spend the CBDC. So it's a way to kind of lock people out of leaving. Now, this gets referred to as interoperability in the world of sort of blockchain, and that people want all of these things to be interoperable, so I could swap one for the other. However, there's still a smart contract, and the smart contract could still be programmed that only certain types of people are allowed to make these exchanges. And it's a way also to have this inclusive system that everyone can be a part of, but at the same time still impose rules for certain people who don't follow some of the other kind of rules that we talked about before. We've also been programmed, definitely in the US, to understand this idea of a credit score. It is kind of a silly idea because we live in this debt-based world, and the idea with a credit score is that if you've been given the privilege of borrowing money in the past and you've paid it back, then you will be given this privilege to borrow money in the future. It does show you that we've sort of been trained that we have to be beholden to this entity that gets to decide whether or not you are issued loans. The irony or the funny thing about that is the majority of these loans are issued out of nothing. So you're paying back nothing with interest. And if you don't do that, then you're punished. It's the system they have is remarkable in that I wish I could just print money out of nothing, lend it to you, and then charge you interest for paying it back. And if you don't pay it back, then I'm going to punish you. Like it's very scalable because I can issue infinite amount of virtual assets out of nothing. So anyway, the credit score idea would just be expanded into social credit scores, carbon credit scores, other types of health scores, so that you will only be able to make these purchases if you meet certain types of conditions. It's pretty powerful. So, definitely a way to force compliance with things that right now people are like, kick me off Facebook, whatever, I don't really care. But if you start fining me and now I can't buy food, or you've programmed my CBDC to only work within 10 miles of my house so that I don't, blow my carbon credit score by traveling too far. Like that's where it gets really messed up and dystopian. Now, the only way, my take, for this kind of thing to work is everybody has to have a unique identifier that is linked to all these databases. Otherwise, how would you know whether or not I'm the same Molly Elmore that posted something on Facebook that, matched that up with my central bank digital currency money? I have many email addresses. I don't use the same ones all the times. And I might have a really common name that you can't match me on my name. So if you're going to have this incredibly sophisticated monetary system that matches all of these databases in real time so that it's checking to see what my score is to make a certain purchase, it requires what's called a universal identifier. It's a digital ID. And this would kind of function like your social security number does in the US, but like I don't use my social security number on Twitter. My bank knows my social security number, but I don't even know if I use that at like doctors' offices. I certainly have the carbon credit thing is completely new. So that would somehow have to be linked somehow to some database that again ties me to my number. And then how does that work actually with households? We have multiple people. But the only way to integrate all of these databases together and get them to talk is by having a unique identifier that everybody uses in all of these places. That is one of the things we can slow down adoption of. In Congress, there is some legislation floating around about digital ID. My suggestion to all of you is don't fall for the sales pitch that digital ID is so awesome and beneficial. It's not really. It's going to make things easier for somebody who wants to implement a centralized control mechanism, but it really doesn't serve you any benefits. It will probably be sold as something for like safety and inclusion and other types of convenience maybe. Just be careful about believing that, because what it could easily do is make all of these dystopian things now possible because these databases could be linked together. I do want to sort of end this on some positive sort of note. Like, none of us have to participate in this. At this point, we have options. One, there's way more of us than there are people who work at central banks. And we could just decide, we're just going to continue to use cash. And the thing is that as long as there are alternatives to the CBDC, we're good. Choice is like our insurance policy. Because if I have a bunch of different options and one of them sucks, we're just not going to use the sucky one. We're just going to use the good one. So CBDCs really can only sort of manifest in this dystopian manner if it's the only choice. And you might be in a situation where your employer decides to pay you in it, and if the smart contract is programmed that you can't switch out, that kind of gets to be a mess. But this is why like having savings is a great idea. It's an insurance policy against being forced to do things you don't want to do. And this is why having money outside the system, or resources, assets, whatever outside the system, gives you some choices, which are key. And we also, this is going to sound weird, but like we want to keep commercial banks. As much as you might think commercial banks are like, don't always act in our interest, you have a choice right now. Like if you are banking with Wells Fargo and you're not a fan, whatever, go switch to a different bank. Right now we have tons of banks to choose from. And so this system helps, this competition helps there to be good options. And if one option is bad, the sort of free market allows you to switch to another one. Now, there isn't really free market in banking. Like you have to be given a license to be a bank. So not anybody can just go start a bank tomorrow, but we still have choice, where in a CBDC world, you don't. Like that's it. There's one central bank in each country. Now in the US, I think we're going to see the wholesale CBDC very quickly. FedNow is going to be implemented. I have no concerns with that at all. However, the retail CBDC is a much more complicated thing. I'm not a fan. It's not in our interest. I don't want all these databases merged together. That, again, centralizes a lot of power into someone's hands. We're not really sure whose hands. Now, in Europe and in the UK, I think we'll probably see this type of thing more quickly. This movement towards centralized control is being run out of Europe, sort of the European aristocracy. They would love to have more control over people. They don't really want the middle class to survive, but you don't have to adopt this. You don't have to say yes to it. And you also don't have to fall for the sales pitch that it's in any of our interests. So I just wanted to clear up a couple things about central bank digital currencies. The wholesale stuff is all good. The retail thing is a totally different story. And it's something that, and if we had a digital currency bill of rights that said, you know what, we're never going to program these things without like some sort of transparent process, like, okay, I would be more open to it. But the fact that that never comes up in discussion and it's very unclear who manages the smart contract makes me very concerned. So if you are in a country where they're going to implement a CBDC, a retail one, be very vocal in asking who controls that smart contract. How can I opt out if I don't want to participate? And will you be linking other databases with the monetary system to potentially use that for political reasons, and force that discussion? Because a lot of people are unaware of this component around the smart contract thing. So you can all do your part and help educate your friends and family about the implications of this and how it would work and how they need digital ID for it to come together. And even if they say you have digital ID, like you need all the social media companies to now force you to log in or create an account that way. This is one of my concerns about Elon Musk's Everything app, is that would be a way for him to get everybody to start over and log in with some sort of digital ID thing. So I'm keeping close tabs on that. All right. I'll see you in the next video. If you enjoyed this, please like the video. That helps me out a lot. And subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you soon.